like if you shoot down a country road or something like that, or a hallway, the lines seem to converge real quick. And I know it's an illusion. It's just perspective. But
Right.
yeah. But there's a couple pictures that I have that I didn't post. I shot down like a corridor that was out in Riverside, and it seemed to, I mean, the corridor was probably maybe 200 feet long, but the end seemed to converge real quick. So I think that's causing that barrel distortion, or not barrel distortion, but lens distortion, accentuates the converging lines. So anyway, yeah, I want to see some of that fisheye work. Well, you got anything? Do you have anything done, or are you gonna?
I've taken a couple quick shots, but they we've talked about this before. I'm a green square shooter, and because I'm a green square shooter, all my test shots, the flash automatically went off.
Okay.
And then I was working with trying to hold my hand over the flash while I took the picture, and then they were underexposed, and
okay.
I was having a lot of issues.
Okay. I actually saw a video today where a guy explained an easy system for shooting manual. So if I can find it, I'll see it. Most of them they tend to be pretty dry and a lot of bullshit and a lot of like you should be shooting manual and this and that, blah blah blah. He seemed pretty good about it. He says I shoot manual because I have a pretty good idea of what I'm doing. I've been doing it for a long time. It's like when you drive a manual car, eventually you don't think about shifting. You get from point A to point B. You've shifted, 500 times and you don't remember one, but you must have because you got there. So that's what he says. He says that mostly what he does is he will adjust his aperture setting. He uses I use the Sony A7 Mark II. He uses an A7 Mark III. So this video is still a couple years old, but I like the way he talked about it. And he was basically saying that you really only have two questions. He says, how do you want your depth of field, or how do you want your or what do you want to do about freezing the action? He says ISO, basically you want your ISO as low as you can get it, because depending on what you're doing, you don't want noise in it. Now, obviously, if you're shooting an indoor, what do you call it? An indoor, if you're shooting a band or something like that, well, your ISO is going to be fairly high because you cannot get away with 100 ISO inside a venue. That's not going to happen. So he was saying that's generally your ISO. You set your ISO, and then you may adjust it, but that's going to be special circumstances. He did say something interesting about the Sunny 16 as far as digital goes. He goes, you set your ISO to what you need. Then he says you set your shutter speed. Oh, no. Okay, I remember now. He says, now I remember. He says you set your aperture to what you want your depth of field. Okay, so if you're shooting landscapes, you'd want a pretty high f-stop number. If you're shooting portraiture and you want to blur the background, then you would have a pretty low f-stop number. But then he says the formula is you set your ISO to the same as your shutter speed. And I go, okay, that's interesting. That might be good for a lot of people. He says, however, I don't use that, and the reason I don't is because I have figured that my shutter speed, I set it works for me at 1,000 thousandths of a second. He says, so if I set my ISO at 1,000, there would be a lot of noise that I really didn't need to get, because he's shooting black and white. He's shooting a lot of shadow. He's shooting a lot of shadow and stuff like that. So there would be a lot of noise inside that shadow. But that might be a good starting place. So you set your shutter speed to you set your ISO. You just match your ISO and your shutter speed. So standard, a comfortable handhold for me would probably be between 100 and 150, roughly. That'd be a low end. So if you set your ISO at 100, well, if you're shooting during the day, obviously, set your ISO at 100 and then you set your shutter speed at 100, 150 or so. That'd be a good starting point. So if you want to try to shoot manual, and if you're shooting outside, you may want to try that. Just set your aperture to either 16, that's why they call it Sunny 16, or Ouija, his favorite aperture was f8. So between so f8, f16. So between f8 and f16, and then set your shutter speed or your ISO at 100, and then your shutter speed at 100 to 150 or whatever, depending on how, if you're getting motion blur or whatever, you're getting camera shake, you can bump it up or whatever. But yeah, I think that would actually be a good starting point for you, especially if you wanted to try shooting manual. That'll give you a good place to start. So f8, ISO 100, shutter speed 100. And that should give you a pretty good, during a sunny day, that should give you a pretty good starting point.
Okay.
Yeah, because I know you're having trouble with getting off of auto. And, yeah. So, I think we talked a ways back about using aperture priority, because all you have to do is change your aperture in order to bump up the exposure. But the problem with aperture priority is that by changing your aperture, the trade-off is that you are you're changing your depth of field. So he talked about that. He said one of the cool things that he talked about was he said that your trade-off, everything has a trade-off. Yeah, adjusting your aperture changes your depth of field. So you have to take that into account. Adjusting your speed, by lowering your speed to bump up your adjustment, you're adding in motion blur. And then by changing your ISO in order to bump up the exposure, you're adding in digital noise. So everything has a trade-off, and you have to take that into account. The most obvious to me is aperture, because if you have to know, do I want everything in focus, or do I want a shallow depth of field? And then you make your decision there. So he broke it down to two kinds of photographers, a sports photographer and a portrait photographer. He says a portrait photographer is going to set his aperture fairly low, and then he's going to adjust not fairly low. Yeah, to a fairly low number, and he's going to adjust his shutter speed in order to compensate. And a sports photographer is going to do exactly the opposite. He needs to freeze action. Otherwise, everything's motion. Otherwise, everything's motion blur. Now, you may want motion blur. If there's a football player hauling ass down the field, and everybody's behind him, and he wants to show that this guy is booking, then he may want motion blur. But if he's trying to freeze action and these people are moving, especially like soccer players or track, they're moving and they're moving fast, he would want to freeze action. So he would probably boost he would set his shutter speed at about 1,000 or higher. And he would adjust his, he would change his exposure by changing the aperture priority. He has to take the aperture priority trade-off, the depth of field trade-off, because he needs to freeze the action. So he has to take into account that he's going to be changing his depth of field every time he changes his aperture. He's going to be changing the depth of field, so he has to take that into account. Now, if it's a sunny day, that may not matter. He may not even have to do anything. You set your aperture once, you're happy, you go to town.
Right.
But if he's indoors, where it's the light is not very good, and in some areas there's bright stadium light, in some areas there's bright stadium lights, and in other areas it's dark shit, then that may cause a problem. But as long as his main subject is in the center of his frame, the people aren't going to notice. They're not going to care.
Right.
Yeah, because anybody following him or farther downfield than him is going to be blurred out. But so what? All that is telling you this guy is the main subject. This is who you should be looking at.
Right.
That's all. So I mean, composition is going to do the same thing. He shoots down. He shoots down the field. You know the guy who's got the ball and he's the closest to you. That's your main subject. Everybody else is a secondary subject. If he's got a shallow depth of field, the main subject will be in focus. Everybody else will be slightly blurred or slightly out of focus. All it is reinforcing the same message. This guy is who you should be looking at. So when he broke it down to a portrait between a portrait photographer and a sports photographer, that made a lot of sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. Well, in wrapping up, I got a getting back to the whole artistic versus autistic.
Yeah.
We've definitely decided Pedo Josh autistic.
Yeah, I think he's autistic.
Leonardo Gonzalez artistic.
Artistic. Yeah.
Because the art matters more than what he's using. He's not really talking about his gear. He's talking about the shot, the techniques he's using to get the shot.
Yeah.
He's working at an art. The other guy's too busy worried about making photos.
Yeah. He's a visual storyteller. He's telling us a story. Yeah. Leonardo, on the other hand, I agree with that. Leonardo, on the other hand, is he's showing us an image. You can make whatever you want out of it, and he's using well, it's not a new technique. I mean, there's nothing new under the sun, but the way he's applying it is interesting, and so I think that he has done something. He's probably experimented 1,000 times. Fine-tuned it a little bit. Somebody said, hey, that's kind of cool. And then somebody else said, hey, that's kind of cool. And then a bunch of people started saying that, and he's thought to himself, okay, this is something that I need to push, see how far I can take it.
He's definitely got his own style. I mean, like I said, I look at these things and go, wow.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
And like you just said, there's a progression to his work too. You can see, as I scroll down, you can see as he keeps doing it, they keep getting better and better.
Yeah, they start getting. Yeah, you take the one. Some of them are. Go ahead.
He's fine tuning that style he's doing.
Yeah, I agree with that. I've seen I've seen some experimentation. Even now, when he had that yellow filter. Well, I remember previously there was one that was red. So he's it's monochrome still, but he's adding in some form of color change. He's adding in some form of color, and the thing is that I just realized he's using if he's using black and white, that color has to be post-processed.
Well, it would have to be, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that until just now. So he's photoshopping it or Lightrooming it or something. He has to be because he's shooting black and white.
I could care less.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I didn't even care that he photoshopped that. That did not even come to my mind. I see this picture. It's got that yellow tint. It's obviously black and white, but I didn't even think, oh, this guy's photoshopping. I didn't care. It doesn't mean anything to me. Yeah. The only thing I care about is the image that I'm presented with. That's it. I mean, yeah. You look at it, it's like, we know from coming from a musical background that it's the same in music. You turn it on and off. That analytical process. You turn it on and off. Yeah. Some people have a little bit harder time. Like when I first started playing harmonicas, I would sit and a lot of times I would start breaking people's styles down. And but still, when I went out to watch live music, I wasn't breaking down styles. I wasn't listening to their licks. I wasn't trying to see what they were doing. Are they tongue blocking, lip blocking? I didn't care. That's not important. But
I hate to quote this movie because our dipshit mutual friend